Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today is going to be a little bit different because I'm not really used to making these, and these are basically reading the comments type videos. And I felt like my last video that I did, which was me addressing my issues with the Digimon card game and giving my perspective as a designer on some of the pitfalls that they're falling into that's making the game a overall worse experience. Because, spoiler alert, I actually love the Digimon card game and I love the Digimon IP, and I just want to see it get better, and unfortunately the direction that I feel like they're headed is not necessarily making the game better. So I felt like I wanted to make the type of video that's actually discussing the issues with the card game and its overall design and design philosophies, like I did about a year and a half ago. So feel free to go watch that video so you can have a frame of reference to kind of see what I was talking about and going to be talking about in this video as I address some of the comments that were made, both on Facebook and in YouTube. So, like anything on the internet, I got a pretty mixed bag of responses. Some were pretty good and positive and wanted to actually continue the discussion. Some were pretty decent at being able to provide their own feedback and solutions, and I think that's pretty neat and important. But others seemed to really not understand the concepts that I was talking about and were completely ignorant of them. And then you also have the other side of things in terms of the negative aspect, where they were being rude and toxic individuals, which is usually never what you want to see, but it's the internet, so you could expect to see it anywhere and everywhere. So I'll be going over a couple of these. I don't know how many I'm actually going to get through, but I want to try to get through some of the discussions and kind of elaborate on my thoughts a little bit more as far as what I was talking about versus what they're kind of commenting on. So if this video is popular enough, then I'll consider doing a follow-up with more comments related to the video as well, or I just might start doing it for comments in general about videos that I make. So let's go ahead and start on the Facebook side of things with a initial question. I'm probably going to have some like robot read it just so you can actually audibly hear it like it's a conversation.
First, I must say I listened to all your episodes for maybe 1 to 2 years, so I believe I have other points of view you don't have, and I believe you are in a negativity bubble, and I don't really think it's okay for you to try to bring others down with you. Now back to your point, there are situations that it happens not in 2 turns, but I see your point. Not denying that you don't always have control is part of the game, and in a meta where people don't use real options, then security is no longer feared. That is just deck building issues that people are trying to make their own deck better, ignoring the opponent. I know that you are against floodgates in decks, but they are a fundamental part of the game. I want to give you my own personal example of this game is fun. Yesterday I went to a 16-person locals and lost to Sakyaman, but had a blast playing Devas, and everyone I played against got surprised by such a different deck.
So this comment kind of stood out to me because it showed that, one, they were a listener. They're no longer a listener, it seems like, which is fine. That's not necessarily an issue. I know my content isn't exactly for everyone, but as far as being in a negativity bubble, I always hate this assumption, because anytime you post something that's criticizing anything, people will just immediately take it as negative when that's not necessarily the truth. I'm being critical because I like the game and I want it to get better and I want it to improve and grow. So, like, otherwise I wouldn't even be doing this to begin with. So, like, them saying that I'm in a negativity bubble is kind of an insult, because that just means that they actually aren't paying attention to what's actually being addressed and they're writing it off, which is, like, fine, that's just what happens on the internet, but there's a clear difference between being negative and being critical, and I am not necessarily negative. You're just taking that as negative, or if people are taking that as negative, that's their own personal prerogative. I am being objectively critical towards the things that I enjoy and I love, which is totally fair and valid for me to do. Now, as far as, like, addressing the comment, I was basically asking them if they're okay with the power creep running rampant, and if they like enjoying two-turn type games where nothing else really seems to matter after a specific point in the game, which is a concern I addressed in the video. And as far as what they basically responded with was, yeah, they're totally okay with it because they were playing their pet deck, and everyone else was having fun. But like, Digimon on a lower power level, taking like the top meta decks out of the equation, is actually a very enjoyable game. I highlighted this on my last podcast episode where I went to locals and I played Hero Apps. It's not a tier 1 deck by any stretch of the word, but it's a very fair deck. And when I played against Imperial, I got completely stomped. That was not a very good, enjoyable experience. But when I faced Medusa, something that is a little bit more in the same power spectrum, it was actually a very good game. It was like a lot of back and forth, a lot of decision points. It was a very enjoyable experience overall, and that's just the night and day experience when anyone's playing like a hyper-toxic meta deck versus something that's good and competent but has very clear and distinct flaws and weaknesses. And that's what card games should be, interacting with the opponent where some things have flaws and weaknesses that actually allow healthy gameplay to exist instead of complete and utter blowout situations because of the sheer power difference between what one deck is allowed to do versus the other from a design perspective. It is and does go back to what I was saying in the video of that disproportionate risk versus reward ratio, where a lot of the top decks are allowed to be able to get away with doing so much more for less effort than a lot of the other decks in the entire game. And as far as the Floodgate portion of the comment goes, I'm not really against Floodgates. It's more just how interactive you can be with the floodgates. So the higher the level the floodgate, the harder it is supposed to be to interact with. But when, again, you have that disproportionate risk versus reward, and it's just super easy to go up into a level 7 for essentially almost next to nothing, and that level 7 or 6 is going to be floodgating you out of the game, while it's going to also simultaneously beat you in the face and probably put you so much farther ahead than the opponent that there's reasonably no game left to be played. That's when there is a little bit more cause for concern. So I think like the lower level floodgates are fine, but again, this goes back to a deck building issue where not every deck is able to run them because most decks want to enhance their gameplay rather than run basically hate cards to try to put the opponent at a disadvantageous situation, assuming they can't actually deal with that lower level floodgate, which some decks can, some decks can't. It really just varies based on what you're actually playing against. But because of the fact that not everyone is going to be playing like that, means that most people aren't going to be playing like that. Some people will splash in like a Tech 1 of Floodgate, but again, it just comes down to, do I see the Floodgates to help me with this matchup particularly? Otherwise, depending on the matchup, the Floodgate might not even be doing anything if you also can't even get to the Floodgate to begin with. So it goes back to kind of like deck building on how deck building really doesn't allow you to run floodgates unless it's built into your deck for you. And as far as the removal kind of side of things goes, I really don't think it's a deck building issue, considering removal options have been so far pushed out of the game. It's like not even funny. It's borderline comedically sad. So, like, removal options, they generally cost a lot, and as of right now, because of the protections afforded to some of the best decks, they just basically get to ignore removal options. So, it makes it really hard to want to run something that is just not going to functionally work anyway. So, instead of removal options, we have changed our mentality to run the cheaper consistency and tempo tools instead. So, it's easier, again, just kind of like what I was saying with the floodgates, to enhance your game plan rather than try to disrupt the opponent's game plan, which is why the only removal cards that are being played are the ones that also just so happen to do something else. Most of these are in the delays, and then you get stuff like Rivals Barrage and Seventh Lightning, where they allow you to do something additional on top of being removal. So those are the only ones that are actually seeing play, and they're not even being played in a high quantity, again, because the removal aspect, it kind of just doesn't matter anymore, because that's likely to not actually remove a Digimon. And then when it comes to it being in the security factor, because it's not being played at a high quantity, and there's not a whole bunch of removal options being played in general, that also goes to contribute why security feels a lot weaker now, is because there's just no real threat in security being played. And again, this is not a deck building issue. It's just a fundamental game mechanic issue that removal options, because of the protections, have been pushed out. And this isn't even including the fact that Digimon have built-in removal to them, so there's even less availability to want to run the removal option, because by Digimon just does the same thing anyway. So I think like that part of what they're trying to state is completely off base and false, because it just shows how out of touch they are with actual modern Digimon deck building and how modern Digimon is actually played. I mean, it makes sense when they're bringing Devas against Sukuyamon and then they lost. That's kind of a no-brainer because of how Sukuyamon plays overall versus how Deva plays. I really don't know what to say there, but I'm not saying that Digimon can't be fun on the lower levels, because like Deva's versus something more comparable to what Deva's level is probably going to be a relatively good and enjoyable experience. And that's the experience that I want to bring to the higher levels, because of just removing the toxicity that the top decks have and the frustration that they can cause. And this, in theory, should help open up the game to just be a more overall enjoyable game, because we actually are engaging with the opponent a little bit more. But the next comment kind of is a very interesting one, and it was partially the big reason why I wanted to make this video, is because this comment has a lot to unpack. So let's just hear what they have to say and start unpacking.
Protection is the only issue I see in the game at the moment. Protection should never be all-encompassing. In my opinion, it's the stuff that says your opponent's effects. Protection just against Digimon effects, for example, is fine. As Pedro said, people can respond to protections like that by playing more options. The meta has to adapt. The breeding area should not be targetable. They're already pushing boundaries by introducing the concept of what is the field. I agree they maybe need to stop releasing decks that do weird shenanigans in the breeding area, because they risk breaking a lot, like with Royal Knights and Demon Lords, but letting decks target the breeding area is not a good idea. You're just opening up to more power creep. In fact, what you're suggesting, saying we need more tools to deal with breeding area, tamers, delay options, that's power creep. If everything can be blown up, control decks will dominate. Floodgates are good, because you can punish certain decks that become too reliant on certain advantages. Generally speaking, I think the game is way different, but still super fun. Problem cards all have checks right now.
So, to kind of start unpacking this, when I'm saying that protection is an issue, like, obviously they're saying, yes, Omni protection is a big issue, but they're more okay with the fact that you could have protection against the opponent's Digimon effects, which I find to be a little bit interesting, because Digimon effects tend to do more than option effects anyway, and that's the majority of what we're actually using is Digimon, not options, because as I already highlighted before in the other comments, we're already not playing removal options, and we just generally don't have the space to run removal options because we need to enhance our game plan, and that's partially part of the problem, is the fact that there is such a heavy emphasis on enhancing our own game plan. But if you are fundamentally moving slower than the opponent, then you're going to have a worse time overall, and you need to be able to keep pace with the opponent, and running removal options sometimes are just going to be bricks in your hand when they could have been something like a training, delay, scramble, whatever, to be able to put yourself into a better position, especially if you're going to rely on your Digimon to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to trying to engage and interact with the opponent. So, like, it's not necessarily a this has to be the way. Like, protections need to have flaws. And yes, obviously, being protected against the opponent's card effects is leaving it for there to be 0 flaws versus protection against the Digimon effects. But because of the way that decks are already built and how we're playing with the game in general, it might as well just be the same exact line of text. It technically isn't, which leaves like those small niches where like Galactimon's coming in because he has an ability that lets him use the option for free, and then that option's going to remove the Digimon, so it's like bypassing that type of protection, but that's afforded to that deck. It's really weird. And the fact that this is a situation where they're stating that the meta has to adapt, but at the same time, we're not given the tools for the meta to adapt in the way to allow that to happen without incidental power creep, just basically changing how removal options fundamentally work in general. It's the unfortunate reality of what they need to do in order to make removal options even remotely playable, outside of the fact that they just should stop printing protection or as much crazy protection as they have been. So like that's an example of like, why do they need to fundamentally change how these selective style of options work when they could just change how they view protection type abilities? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, and as a result, until something happens between either the protection or the removal, the meta literally will not change and adapt to it because we have no reason to, and the only changes that the meta is going to happen is decks are going to need to go faster and faster and faster, which is the cycle that we're currently finding ourselves in, and why a deck like Megidramon is able to perform so well is because it's able to just move as fast as humanly possible to bypass basically anything and everything that the opponent could potentially be doing to you. And then when it comes to the whole comment on the whole breeding area should not be targetable, I 100% agree. That seems like the direction that Bandai wanted to go, where it's something that you generally don't want to try to touch, but that doesn't mean that they can't design effects around things moving in and out of the breeding area. Well, I guess more specifically out of the breeding area. So, like, a card like Slayer Dramon from EX3 is like the perfect example of things they should try to experiment with more. Same thing with like BT5 Sakuyamon, where it's interacting with things actually being moved out, applying a debuff to them to try to make their Digimon that they just moved out a little less useful. It's literally one of the big reasons why Shine Greymon Ruin Mode is as oppressive as it is, because most of the time, we're not digivolving into level 5s in our raising area. We're digivolving into level 4s at most, and Shine Greymon Ruin Mode basically will just delete it the second that Digimon moves out of the raising area, which is, again, partially why that card is so oppressive. So there's, like, room for them to experiment with the ability to force Digimon out of raising and try to force interactions that happen the second they move out of raising. So, like, there's space for those types of cards to exist without directly attacking the breeding and raising area. Just the idea of trying to interact isn't necessarily adding power creep, because this is going into like your third or the third part of this comment, where suggesting that having actual ability to interact with stuff is power creep. No, that's not entirely true. So, like, a card that just removes cards out of the trash, I don't necessarily think is huge levels of power creep. Depending on how it's implemented, it could just be how the card functions. So, in just the existence of those cards is not necessarily a bad thing. So that's why, like, Magic the Gathering is a really good example of this, where anytime they have heavy grave-based mechanics, they usually will pair it up with a grave hate card, so that way you actually have answers to those grave-based mechanics. Otherwise, those grave-based mechanics are going to go untouched, and they're going to be the best things in the game. So, like, and that's one of the big proprietors on Yu-Gi-Oh! On how, like, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is super trash heavy, and the fact that they have cards to interact with it. Like, if you have something that needs to be kept in check, then you add in the interaction to keep it in check. That's kind of what Paladin mode was supposed to be, and The only unfortunate thing is he's coming out too slow. That's what we were using Black Auto Uber for, was because it was one of the only cards at the time that actually could interact with the trash, so we could try to snipe those Digimon that we knew that they were going to be targeting out of their grave. I don't necessarily think adding extra levels of interaction for problematic abilities and card types is a problem at all. Now, with Tamer removal and delay removal, I think that's a little bit more slippery territory, because the second you introduce too good of removal for them, you could run the risk of completely and utterly destroying those card types depending on how the removal is. Like, well, is there actually a problem with being able to remove delayed options? I generally don't think there is. It's just a card that's going to sit on the opponent's field, and then they pop it when they're going to be comboing off. It's the most uninteractive card type in the entire game because we don't really have a lot of ways to be able to interact with them, and they in turn are causing parts of the problem. So if we actually have the ability to remove delayed options, like let's just say a rookie with an on-play ability to delete a delayed option and draw one card, like, I don't necessarily think that's going to be hardcore power creep. I really don't. It gives us a meaningful way to interact with delayed-based options while giving us, like, some sort of initial benefit for using it, and it kind of is acting like a pseudo-floodgate at that point. Like, if you're, like, championing floodgates, you should be championing the ability to interact and remove with uninteractive card types and elements. Like, what's the difference between a card that says, let's take your entire grave and shove it to the bottom of your deck, versus a card that just says, like, hey, I'm a floodgate that just says the opponent can't engage with their trash. Like, they can't use their trash for anything. They can't pull cards out, they can't summon from it, like, they just can't touch their grave. Like, what actually is the difference between those? The only real difference is you're giving the opponent a level of interaction to interact with them interacting with you, but once the floodgate is gone, then the gates are unleashed, and they could do whatever they were going to do, and, like, floodgates, especially on the lower level, aren't necessarily that hard to remove. So I do think, like, we need kind of, like, this balance between hate and floodgates, but at the same time, because they're both achieving, like, a very similar output in terms of the role that we're assigning it on being a hate card, like, that's initially going to be semi-problematic for how the game currently is played, because we don't actually have a good, meaningful deck space to run it unless it's something that's, like, really just already built into something. And it's funny because floodgates also come in various different levels, so if you're okay, like, if you're just referencing low-level floodgates, that's fine, but the fact that we have, like, level 6 and level 7 floodgates that literally just stop the opponent from playing the game, then I think that's where floodgates start to become problematic. What makes them even more problematic is the fact that we have such an easy and quick way to get into them to shut the opponent out of the game, and that's the initial problem with high-level floodgates. It's not the high-level floodgate itself, because they're designed to be somewhat balanced for the environment that they were designed for. But when we add in elements to just speed up the game unnecessarily, that's when things start breaking in half, and that's why we were championing Mirage for being banned, is because he's a floodgate for the opponent drawing cards, which is a fundamental game thing that people are going to be doing. It's a compounding factor on the fact that we could go up into him for basically no memory at all. I honestly think, like, Mirage wouldn't be as problematic if we didn't have the training cards to push things even further and even faster. As I highlighted in the video, the training cards actually did a lot of damage, because not only are there another delay option that just you're gonna pop, it just creates lots of tempo issues, and the fact that we actually have no way to actually engage with that to stop that type of game plan outside of a very hyper-specific floodgate, which, again, might not even do anything, is part of the problem. So, like, there's a lot when it comes to how we want to engage and interact with the opponent's cards. Yes, not everything is as simple as just make a card to blow it up, but we do need more interesting ways to be able to engage with those types of cards to try to keep them in check, so that way they don't just completely destroy the game and run rampant. I know that was a little bit of a long bit, and I do think that also kind of covered the fourth bit, talking about floodgates a little bit, but it is really funny to see that, like, yes, the game is still super fun, but the problematic cards do not have any checks. That is such a false statement. It's, like, borderline comedic. And I know this video's gone on long enough, and I'm probably not going to be covering anymore, even though there is a lot of comments both on Facebook and on YouTube that I could be covering. I'll kind of just do like a little bit of a Facebook roundup because there was a very common misconception when it came to what I was referring to interaction was. So a lot of people sometimes think that interaction is kind of just like counterspells and hand traps, things that you play during the opponent's turn to disrupt them. That is a form of interaction, but that's not specifically the type of interaction that I was referring to. So the specific type of interaction I was referring to was more just if there's a card on the opponent's field, I should be able to do something about that card. So whether it's a tamer, delayed option, Digimon, card in trash, whatever it is, I should have a way to be able to deal with that. Sure, you could make the argument that the breeding area is like the safe haven, don't touch it zone, and I think like fine, that could be allowed. A lot of games have like this removed area that sometimes they also can pull from that the opponent generally sometimes can't even touch, but that's neither here nor there. I think like having something like that's fine as long as we have some way to engage with the cards as they're coming out, more than just some of the lingering floodgate effects that we have. But regardless, I think that interaction, the ability to deal with the opponent's cards and interact with them is definitely something that's being lost because of how we're actually playing the game more than the abilities themselves. Because yes, there's a ton of different Digimon that have built-in removal for them and allows you to actually interact with the opponent's Digimon or cards in that matter. But sometimes those transactions are one-sided and, well, you could deal with their stuff, but they can't deal with your stuff, and then that makes it a very uninteractive experience for the other player. So, like, it's just very interesting on how we all go about defining what interaction is and what we're actually looking for out of interaction. So I think that was something I probably could have cleared up a little bit more in my main video, but it definitely seems like I'm clearing it up now, at least in a very mild way, and not like my heavy, I'm going to go like hardcore on writing the script to try to fine-tune it to be as intricate as I could possibly make it in terms of how I'm going to express what I'm feeling. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video. This subject, more specifically, I might continue exploring in a future podcast episode. I don't know. We'll see where that goes from here. I hope you enjoyed this type of content, and if you did, feel free to tell me your thoughts about not only just the comments that you saw, but my responses to the comments down in, well, the comments below. And if this video does well, then I'll consider doing more of them, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Later.